Hey everyone, and welcome today to our webinar on mastering mergers and acquisitions and how IT leaders drive integration stability and speed. My name is Tom Lilly. I'm going to be running the session here today, and I am joined by my esteemed colleagues here in our office of the CTO here from Netrix. I have Chris Clark, who covers security for our team, Mike Lutenberger, who covers AI. I have Sat Sharma, who covers our digital workplace, and then I have Sean McManus, who covers our data. So what we really want to talk about today is mergers and acquisitions and even a little bit of divestitures and what this means for organizations that are undertaking these things. One of the things that we've been seeing a lot over the past years, across our environment and across our customers is a huge shift toward mergers and acquisitions and then obviously divestitures. Whether it's because of just organizations wanting to grow inorganically, whether it's just the nature of the economy, we're seeing a lot of our customers really choosing to expand their practices and expand their organizations. And with that comes a lot of challenges. Some things that are very easy to really figure out and to talk about and think about, and some that just really people aren't thinking about. What we want to talk through today is really what that means for our customers, what we're seeing in the market, how we approach mergers and acquisitions, and then at the end, let's talk a little bit about how Netrix can help your organization as you are bringing other companies into the fold for you all. So with that, let's talk about some specific technologies and dive right into it. So when we're talking about mergers and acquisitions, really the biggest thing is how do we integrate these two organizations? How do we take these two separate orgs, and how do we make them, first of all, to sort of be able to talk to each other? And then how do we actually get them to integrate really nicely with each other as well? Obviously the goal would be that we have these companies operating eventually like they are one organization, like they are one company, like they are, have always been together and will never be separated. And when we're talking to our customers about M&A, the first place that we generally start as we're talking through actually doing that integration is the lowest level that you can probably think of, and that's networking. So the overwhelming majority of our customers have an on-premises networking footprint. They've still got server racks and cabinets, they've still got data centers, they've still got branch offices, remote offices, and at the end of the day, they all need to be able to talk to each other. That's the easiest way, and that's the plumbing that's going to really underpin a lot of the other things we're going to talk about here in the future, like email and like identity, and even things like file sharing. Now, if your organization is lucky enough or has moved far enough into the future where you are cloud only, that you're only in Azure, you're only in M365, you're only in Salesforce or other SaaS solutions, you don't really have to worry a lot about networking integration. But once again, for probably 95% of our customers that, from what I'm seeing, the network integration piece is still really, really key. And the first thing you have to figure out is how you want to integrate those networks. And there's a couple different ways depending on what your networking looks like. The easiest way and where we usually see our customers start is just going hub to hub. So I've got a data center from company A and I've got a data center from company B. Let's just establish some sort of site-to-site connectivity. Let's just establish an IPsec VPN, and now they can talk to each other. I can route all that traffic over that individual connection. That's really good for short term, by the way. From a latency perspective, that can become very problematic because now you have multiple hops as you're getting from like remote office to data center to remote office. So, for maybe 90 days, 120 days, that's a good place to start, but you eventually want to do full integration. Now, as a lot of our customers are moving towards software-defined networking and SD-WAN, that becomes a bit of an easier topic. So now I can peel off sites from company A's SD-WAN and merge them into company B, or company B into company A, depending on which way you want to go. That's probably the easiest way that we're seeing. So if you have adopted SD-WAN, or both your organizations have adopted SD-WAN, hopefully the same SD-WAN solution, it does make things quite a bit easier. One of the other areas you do also have to worry about is IP overlap. Some SD-WAN vendors will handle that nicely, whether you can do things like VRF, whether you can do NATing or padding. There are ways that you can essentially make sure you have that full connectivity. That's going to be very dependent on your vendor, but honestly, long term, the best solution is to re-IP everything. I know everybody hates to talk about re-IPing everything, but sorry, it's just the nature of the beast. As you get into a more consistent IP scheme across both organizations, as you move into sort of the longer term, integration of the organizations, sorry, it does generally make a lot more sense just to change everybody's IPs that need to be changed. So that's something that does take a lot of planning, doing a full list and a full inventory of your services, whether you have an IPAM solution or not, and sort of figuring out where you want everything to end up at the end of the day. It does generally cause an outage, something you'll have to figure out with your individual organizations. But at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, it's the easiest way to go. It's the simplest way to go. And it's the best from a long-term integration perspective. So I know everybody's going to hate to hear that, but sorry, like I said, it's just what has to happen. Once that plumbing is in place, though, that it really becomes the enabler for a lot of different things. And probably the biggest thing that we're seeing from an initial integration perspective is identity. It's, hey, how do my users authenticate? How do they get authorized to access applications? How do they, how do their workstations operate? Things like that. With that, I'm actually going to turn this over to Chris Clark, who's going to talk a little bit about the identity side, because I don't want to speak for you, Chris, but I certainly see that as probably one of the most important integration points for any merger.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'd say it's one of the key technology domains when we're talking about M&A and divestiture scenarios here, right? We kind of want to use the terms of source and destination, right? When we're talking about generally, here's the source company, here's the destination company in this case. But even at the very kind of low level of where is the source of truth of identity for those two sides, right? So that could be HRIS system, it could be even Active Directory by itself, right? So we want to kind of get to that level, but really understand how users are using identity. And then it even wraps into the security controls around identity, right? We'll ultimately get to how are users using MFA. So hopefully everyone we're working with as in M&A scenarios has at least MFA as the baseline, right? But it could be different types of MFA. We might be talking about Microsoft, might be talking about other third-party MFAs like Duo, whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of variables here that we have to take into account. But if we kind of break that down in thinking about what we're calling the source tenant in a tenant-to-tenant migration scenario. So the tenant itself, we use the tenant term a lot with Microsoft 365 tenants, right? But it could be Google, they could be on-prem only, right? So there's a lot of variables there that we have to take into account. But ultimately, those users are used to using some form of identity, their username and password, right? And maybe they're even using passwordless, right? So there's, again, a lot of variables there. But they're used to, working a certain way, using a certain user login that's considered on the Microsoft 365 side a user principal name. So it could be something as simple as, the source company has first name, last name at email domain. The destination company that they're being brought into on the acquisition side is using first dot last, right? So even that kind of simple thing that you would say one think would be an impact is a huge impact, right? Because that's what users expect. It's what they're used to doing, and now they're part of a large organization or whatever the case may be in our scenarios, and we have to take that into account. So typically setting that foundational pieces up, we have technologies like cross-tenant sync, B2B users that are set up as kind of a housing to get the connection between the tenants is one key area. And then we really start to map out all those other areas, right? There's single sign-on apps that the source tenant's going to be using. There's single sign-on apps that the destination tenant is using. It's potentially overlap, right? You have some common apps like Salesforce that maybe two sales organizations are using, right? And M&A scenarios. So lots of variables there. You have to kind of just make sure that you get all that information in from the beginning, right? To have that identity foundation, and we'll see as we start to talk about like security and as I mentioned, identity controls, it wraps into that. So,
Yep.
and then one other big variable I think you mentioned too is you have a concept of IDP, right? So identity provider. So you might, even though it's a Microsoft 365, your source tenant might be using Okta or Ping, right, or OneLogin, whatever the case may be, and you have to map that, to some destination tenant that might not be using that. So that's a very large change, right, from that perspective. So,
Yep, definitely. And I want to circle back to something that you had said earlier as well, that I feel like a lot of our customers aren't thinking about. So you mentioned things like UPN structure and email address structure that, hey, company A is using first name dot last name, company B is using first initial last name or something along those lines. I think the internal piece is important for your users to understand how to log in and how that may change. But I think the external visibility is also important. That as you're working with clients, if they're used to emailing clark@netrixllc.com, and now all of a sudden we've got Sean.McManus who you're interacting with, that can cause some customer confusion. So,
yeah,
from that perspective, I think it's also important that, that be communicated and sort of centralized. And that could actually back rev into updating your source tenant as well. That maybe your target tenant that's using first initial last name, maybe now you need to do that for your source tenant as well, just so you have that full parity between the two. So I think it's important not to lose sight of the external visibility of that as well.
yeah, agree. And it kind of leads to, we're by nature, we're concentrating on a lot of like technology pillars, right? But user adoption is wrapped into everything here. So again, if you're communicating your user adoption capabilities, your user communications, this is your new UPN, right? This is what's different. This is going to be your new experience. Maybe this is how you register for MFA as an example. That's kind of I would say a key theme throughout what we're talking about too as well. So not just the technology per se. So.
Yeah, and even things that are perceived as being as simple as, hey, the background in your M365 login is going to change. Hey, the logo is going to be company A instead of company B. Like, expect to
Yeah.
see this. It's not, you're not being phished. I think that's important, and I I'm glad you brought up, user adoption and user communications, because I do think that is very underrated for a lot of our customers as they do M&A. That's a huge piece for everybody. You want to make sure your users are aware of what's happening and why it's happening and when it's going to happen and things like that. Because when somebody gets moved to the new tenant, if they have their old credentials, now they can't get into their files, they can't get into their email, they can't talk to their coworkers or their peers or God forbid, their clients. And I think that does become really problematic. Um,
Yep.
and speaking of the data side and speaking of collaboration and things like that, obviously from what we're seeing from a large majority of our customers, especially the ones that are focused on M365, is a huge focus on SharePoint and OneDrive just being an extension of SharePoint and Teams being an extension of SharePoint, and everything sort of being built on SharePoint, using that for data storage and centralized collaboration, and getting data moved between SharePoint environments, whether it's sites or OneDrives or Teams, chats and files and things like that, I think is important. So with that, Chris, thank you for that initial discussion. We'll definitely come back to you, but Sean and maybe Mike, if you guys want to talk a little bit about the SharePoint side of things,
Sure.
I know we've seen some heartache there on occasion.
Yeah, I mean the key thing on the collaboration side, and I guess this isn't any different from those other pillars as well, is you have to do your due diligence up front. Don't skimp on the discovery efforts, because that is where you're going to uncover all of those nuances and all those edge cases that are going to be huge pain points down the road if not addressed up front. So, specifically when we talk about SharePoint, often that's a SharePoint tenant to tenant migration. It could be file server into SharePoint. It could be on-prem SharePoint into cloud SharePoint. But there's a lot of things, nuances with SharePoint that you have to understand. So that's things like, are you using SharePoint as just a document library? Do you have those sites set up as corporate intranets? Are there things built into those sites like SharePoint Framework Web Parts? or other embedded elements in those pages that aren't going to translate neatly when you move from one tenant to the next. Other things like external sharing configuration mismatches. As one company set up a certain way, another company set up differently. You have to understand those particular nuances and what that's going to mean for your target state. Other things like document challenges. So if you are going from an on-prem or a file system into SharePoint Online, there's a limitation to the length of the file name on that as in SharePoint. And so you have to be able to identify that up front. Are there certain files that need to be renamed? Do you need to do any work, preliminary work ahead of time to prepare that file data for migration? And then the biggest one that we see are things like sophisticated Excel spreadsheets that are being used with lots of integrations, lots of potentially links inside of those spreadsheets that are going to be prone to breaking when you're just moving that file from one place to the next. So being able to use some tooling and do some early discovery on all of those conditions to identify where those potential pain points are is going to save you a ton of headache down the road. Mike, anything you want to add on the SharePoint side?
Yeah, and it's kind of, I guess, not just SharePoint, but it's overall kind of data, right? So a couple things you want to definitely consider is, should I bring everything? And kind of the analogy I always give is, cool, you're moving to a new house and you've got all this junk in your garage. Are you just going to pick up the junk and move it to your new house's garage, or now's the time to clean that stuff up? And especially if we're going to talk about AI, right? Because if you're bringing back all of this legacy stuff, that stuff's going to be, getting pulled up in AI when they're starting to use it. And a lot of folks are like, oh, like we have all these kind of different versions of these policies. I don't want to bring 2010's policy over, and nor should you, right? So, we definitely do that with customers where we understand what do we need to archive, what needs to be brought over, and what's called, what I would say, like the present files, right, that we're using. And then we can look at archiving those, whether it's in Azure or, SharePoint archive or whatnot, and what that means, because that's important. I think one of the overlooked pieces that a lot of customers don't think of. They just think we're going to pick it all up and move it as is. And also not only just the cleanliness of that data, but even what happens a lot of times is restructuring. Also, again, if you have this opportunity to restructure your house a certain way when you move, this is the time to do it. So again, a lot of stuff gets buried in folders of folders of folders of folders. This is your time to kind of flatten those things out, which architecturally makes more sense around that. Kind of dovetailing into that, though, is also the tool, right? So that is also, in my opinion, an important component, because some users want to manually migrate that, which isn't necessarily a problem, but a couple things you'll miss out on by not using a tool besides speed and ease is some of the metadata that's on there, right? If you manually move stuff over, you're going to have everything is going to be whoever moved it, right? And the date of today, right? So if you have audits or things like that that have to know, we can only keep, this data has to be audited every 2 years or something, that's all gone, right? If you manually migrate that over, everything is going to have today's date, and whoever moved it, it's theirs now, right? So by using a tool, those tools can keep those things attached to the content, right? Where document, who created it, when it was modified, all that fun stuff, it will come over with that. So from an auditing perspective, those are generally super important things that folks look for and hope for in their migration.
Well, and not just auditing, but also, if things like legal holds and e-discovery and things like, and just legal in general tends to like to know who owns files and who made changes. And sometimes the governance team doesn't, but it's just the nature of that. I think that's a really good call out.
Yeah, the other big pain point we see with some of this stuff is with teams, and migrating teams from one tenant to another isn't a huge challenge, but when you start talking about the chat history, private chats, group chats, that's where things start to get more complicated, and the current set of tools just don't do a great job at handling that. The user experience is somewhat jarring when you're trying to migrate all of these personal chats. They'll get replayed kind of in order as the migration's happening. And so what we tend to advise our clients is, if you really don't need to bring cross chat history, don't. Limit that to the chats that are incorporated within a given team. Those come over cleanly, but those personal chats can be quite problematic. So it's a good idea to, maybe use other means to archive those if the content needs to be kept, but not necessarily bringing those into the new tenant.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then the other area I wanted to talk about too that often gets overlooked is Power Platform. So when we talk about Power Platform, that can be Power Apps and Power Automate primarily. Power BI, I kind of consider that its own thing, even though it has the Power name. That's all on your data side, data and analytics side. But Power Platform and Power Automate, those things are also somewhat problematic to be moved automatically with tooling. Tooling is catching up on that, and I think someday those will be able to be migrated more automatically, but right now there's a lot of manual efforts in that. So things like those Power Automate flows have connectors that are going out to different systems. Those connectors all have to be repointed. They have to be set up differently. There's licensing considerations potentially if you're using third parties in any of those tools. And so those are definitely things that you have to consider as you're moving Power Platform objects from one to the next. We don't tend to see a whole lot of heavy usage in that in some of the M&A projects that we've done. They tend to be one-offs, but your mileage may vary and you may have a heavy usage in that needs to be considered as you're going to be migrating that data into the new tenant.
And I also
Yeah, I mean,
think that's where Tom was saying about the user adoption services, right? Letting your users know that this change is coming and things like that in Power Apps, or again, if they were on-prem doing like info path forms, like what do I do with that? Because you're not going to
oh,
be able to move
geez.
that, right?
That's a callback right there.
Well, there's gray here, so I'm a little old. Yeah, but
And there's all those other sort of side pieces too, like Planner, Loop, Streams, Microsoft Forms, Whiteboard, Viva Engage, and those are things that like aren't generally considered core to any kind of M&A project, but they may be core to like the 5 people that are using it. And so
Mhm.
you definitely want to be able to do that upfront discovery and survey work to understand where those little pieces are hidden and at least be forthcoming on what needs to be done, for those owners of those objects.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agreed on that. And that's another important call out is that even if it's not important to the organization, it could be important to somebody and what they do on a day-to-day basis. Microsoft pushed out Power Automate and Flows as a citizen developer, low code,
Yep.
no code automation platform. Some people rely on that. I think eventually we'll see some of those things go into things like Copilot Cowork and other AI tools, but still those flows can be central to people literally getting their job done. And if they just get forgotten about and nobody thinks about bringing them over, I think that can certainly be problematic. The other thing that you mentioned, Sean, before we move on to the next topic that I think is also important, you mentioned the connectors. When we talk about Azure here in just a little bit, we'll talk about some similar topics, but it also gets back to identity. Is that, hey, I've got this connector that's got this permission, but that permission is in my old tenant. Now, when I move that thing, I need
Yep.
to make sure it gets re-permissioned, and maybe there's a difference in security in the new tenant where you can't do that, or maybe you have to get a different approval. So, I think there's a lot more work there than people realize. Than just like, okay, now I've got this workflow. Cool, it's here. Now it's there. Everything's hunky dory, and it's just going to work out of the box.
Yep. One final thing before we move on.
Mhm.
The challenge is sometimes the admin centers on the Microsoft site don't do a great job of identifying where all of those objects lay. So if somebody's creating their own private Power Automate flow that they're using, and it's really important to them, it may not have visibility on that admin center. So there are definitely some tricks that you need to leverage to be able to get that full picture of what objects are out there.
Think of things like user surveys, questionnaires, really managers having these discussions during their one-on-ones. I mean, I think for as old school as it sounds that we just send out a questionnaire to people and ask them, are you using flows or are you using, X, Y, and Z? It's still a great data capture tool.
Yeah.
At least get 95% of that data.
Well, furthermore, even if you're using something like a PowerShell script to go out there and get down at that level, who knows if that flow is even still being used? It could have been something that somebody created like 3 years ago and they're not using it anymore. So the survey is really the better way to get that like current up-to-date usage information.
Yeah. Which once again, it's interesting. It just sounds old school, but
Yeah.
sometimes the oldest ways or the older ways work out really well.
Yep.
Chris, what do you got?
I don't want to throw a curveball here, but it's pretty relevant for our conversation. It's something completely new that I'm thinking of. Kind of maybe put you guys on the spot to have an initial answer. It's AI, right? So what are we going to do with agents? How are we going to migrate agents?
What's that?
Between tenants?
Say something.
Artificial
Right?
intelligence, right? Yeah. Okay.
Completely new domain of what we have to concentrate on in an M&A scenario. Can an agent migrate from Copilot as an example, or other AI tools? It's I think we're exploring it. At least I am, of course, but don't necessarily have an answer. But curious if you guys had initial thoughts on that. But we could even have another panel on that topic, probably entirely.
On AI, yeah, probably 10 panels on that.
Right. So
yeah, very similar, right, to Power Platform of, not a good way to rewire it right into things or the flows that it's doing. Or again, it's all going to tie back to, which I think is kind of the crucial foundation, is the identity, right, of the individuals. And again, depending on how it was created, some of those are getting Entra IDs now, right? And that's kind of how it's looked at. So all of those things have to be in consideration. Or if they weren't using Copilot, whether you have like ChatGPT or Claude and they have that all hooked up and, from an enterprise perspective into their tenant, and now they need to bring that over to the other tenant. Same rules apply here. All the stuff we're talking about with identities and apps and all that fun stuff has to be considered.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I can tell you right now, most of the migration tooling is not going to cover Copilot agents and things like that right now. Those are going to have to be addressed in a more manual way, at least for now.
Yeah.
I mean, those things are changing day by day, week by week. So I have no doubt that those tools will eventually catch up. I just don't know when that's going to be. So I do want to move on because we have not had a chance to hear from Sat yet, and I feel bad for him for just sitting here politely on mute as we're all talking about other stuff. But Sean, you mentioned Power Platform. You mentioned the fact that a lot of times it's either left behind or it's ignored, or it's just thought of as sort of this ad hoc service that may need to get moved over. I think another area that we've seen that really be the case as well is digital workplace. Once again, talking about how your users talk to each other and talk to the outside world. The workplace side of things is really important too, and we don't want to lose sight of that. So, Sat, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about what that is and what we're seeing in the markets.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think digital workplace is one of these areas that I think we have all have experienced, oftentimes gets overlooked. And what I mean by digital workplace is voice, right? You have your voice services, your telecom services, your contact center. If you are serving your own clients today, what is that platform? Because it has hooks into pretty much everything we do. And then we have meeting rooms, your conference spaces, meeting spaces. I have been in too many conversations where we talk about M&As, we've got the groundwork happening, and then somebody comes as we are getting close to wrap things up. Oh, we have this voice services and that nobody accounted for. So it's really critical, but it's amazing how often it gets overlooked. And I think part of the problem is the visibility. It's like not properly documented in most cases, especially if these systems are something that's running outside of your Microsoft ecosystem, right? So this conversation obviously is focused more on the Microsoft 10-to-10 migrations. As companies are adopting Teams Phone, for example, as their voice platform, it is becoming more and more critical to make sure these external calling capabilities are accounted for. And there is, this is how businesses interface with outside world, right? We do internal team-to-team chat, internal meetings, things like that. That's great. But how do your clients contact you? So this is what I keep talking to my clients, is that is the main mechanism. We have clients where external calling is the way they do business, right? So it is very, very important to make sure things are accounted for. Something that Sean mentioned and Mike as well, the due diligence and auditing. Like this is going to be the two main things to make sure we are spending some time understanding how the voice services are used and what needs to move over. So the tenant to tenant migration is one thing. We need to move this workload from tenant A to tenant B, but there are underlying things behind it, like consolidations. You have licensing, right, that plays into it. If you are coming from Cisco's, Avaya's, or other third-party on-premises phone systems, how does that work in the Microsoft side? Some of these older systems have a very unique call flows, integrations. How do those, because those users, their whole world is about to change when they go into the Microsoft phone systems, which ties back to something Krish mentioned, right? The user adoption training. So as we are lifting and shifting, which honestly, in most of the case, is not just lift and shift. So maybe I shouldn't have used the term. It is a migration, right? And again, it depends on what the source is, the destination, and then how some of these call flows work. There are a lot of other corner cases too that oftentimes gets overlooked. For example, let's say you are in financial or some regulated industry. There is some strict compliance requirements these people have to follow, and that includes call recordings, right? Call analytics. You have transcription on it. Like, how do you make sure those capabilities are retained, as well as we move over those historical data? Because these compliance people have to maintain the recordings for 7 years and things like that, and then we run it through like a e-discovery compliance tooling. So there's a lot of that. Reporting is the other thing, analytics. And also, as companies are adopting technologies like Teams Phone, there is a big focus on emergency calling and notification, right? There is several FCC guidelines, regulations, because now users are able to use Teams from on the go, from their mobile phone, from home PC, on public networks. There are guidelines and services that we have to account for to make sure their emergency calling are working as expected, right? So that's kind of mostly just the voice portion of it. I mean, we can be on this call for a very long time if we deep dive into contact center, but just gonna keep it real high level. So contact centers are not, there is a reason why it's called contact center now, not a call center, because it's not all about voice. There is a lot of different avenues that the users get support with. I am personally always, my first go-to is web chat, right? Like if I'm in meetings and whatnot, I have to get something done on the side, I can do web chats. There is web chat, there's SMS, there is voice calling, emails, all are just different handles. And then behind the scene, as a business, these technologies have plugins, right? They have integrations in your CRM, your ERP, your database lookup, things like that. So we have to factor all those things. And maybe in some cases, when we are doing this tenant to tenant migrations, the destination tenant may already have a contact center solution, right? Or they may not. So there are different scenarios that we have to make sure are accounted for when we do this kind of work. So first step is always a deeper discovery, due diligence type work to make sure we account for all the use cases and then how those things are going to transition into the next phase. Consolidation, like I mentioned, there is also potential savings in some cases when the destination tenant is using something already that we can use and then offload some of these use cases, right? So there is a ton of them, and same thing with meeting rooms. Just real quick, obviously a lot of the companies are going back to return to office. I feel like RTO term is very overused these days, but it's true, right? So people are coming back into the offices. All these meeting room, conference room solutions are being used more than ever before. Not only like within the companies working with each other, but also working with partner organizations, offshore teams, things like that. So as this M&As are taking place, a lot of the times we inherit technology that obviously we did not deploy. So what are these toolings, right? The end of life, what platform do they even register with? If we are bringing something that has been out there for a while, now it has to work with Teams room systems. Now we have to run a whole series of compatibility check, not only for it to work with Teams, but also how do we monitor, how do we manage, how do we make sure the rooms are going to be fully functional the next morning before the executives walk into the room. So there's all these things that factor into making these conference rooms technology work. So there's definitely a fair amount of due diligence and migration path for those things.
Yeah, and I mean, taking that a step further, and then shifting gears slightly, and then a harder shift back toward Mr. Clark here, is also how do you book those rooms? So things like email and calendar and free busy sharing and inter organization relationships and things like that also become super important, so that even before you move somebody's mailbox and their calendar and all this stuff, that they have that ability to look and see that somebody's available, or what rooms are in what location if you're using room lists, or where can I book stuff, where am I, what office am I working out of, that kind of thing. I feel like the email and calendaring piece is kind of table stakes, that yes, people are going to want their email, they're going to want their calendars to come over cleanly, as part of some sort of acquisition. But once again, getting back to the user experience, and then what do they do with that, and then what does that look like? What is that sort of immediate organization relationship look like, then moving into things like free busy sharing, and then getting into the, okay, now we're going to start moving your mailboxes over, which is once again inclusive of calendar. I think that's another piece that really helps the user set their expectations, and really helps, if you do it well, I think it's a high visibility sort of migration.
Absolutely, 100%. Especially, and just one last statement real quick, especially now with solutions like Microsoft Places, for example, right? So as companies are dabbling into Microsoft Place, which requires them to upload their floor plans, their conference rooms, their reservable, desk pools and things like that, like some of this content or the data set is not just going to move, right? So there is a fair amount of planning, and then overlaying Copilot on top of it, right? So all these tools are supposed to make users more productive, but that being said, it also needs to be carefully planned in this M&A type situation.
Yeah, it's all about getting the data, whether it's those floor plans and building the digital twins, or whether it's making sure everything else is available, is extremely important. But
Absolutely.
Going back to something I think we've all said at some point in this recording and webinar, that planning, doing an assessment, running through what is in the source, what is in the target, sort of figuring out what the security policies are. I think that also gets to be really important, because if Chris, you were talking earlier about MFA. If one organization is enforcing MFA and the other one isn't, odds are that you want to shift toward everybody using MFA, or everybody using Intune for device management, or everybody using Purview or DLP. So I think that security tooling is the other piece that also becomes really visible for your users as they have to start labeling, or as they have to start using multi-factor, as they have to start enrolling into device management. So Chris, I'm going to actually turn it back over to you to talk a little bit about the security side. And then just as a time check for us, because I want to be respectful of everybody who's watching this as well, we've got about 10 minutes or so left.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the security conversation is interesting too, because we kind of briefly touched on licensing there, right, when we were talking about digital workplace, but relevant for overall licensing, especially when we're talking about Microsoft 365 tenants. So you could have a scenario where the source tenant has M365 E5, and they have all these different security and compliance features enabled. Users are used to them. That's their daily experience, right? And then destination tenant might only have E3, or might only have Office 365, whatever the case may be. But you have to map those capabilities, like you said. So I mean, it's the the coexistence is key, right? That's kind of the key theme there. But security, specifically MFA, as you mentioned, is key, right? No matter what, users are going to have to register for the destination tenant's MFA choice, right? So if it's authenticator, users are going to have to actively go out, scan a QR code, register authenticator on iOS or Android. But as a best practice, we're moving lots of clients to passwordless methods, right? So that's kind of a whole new thought process of maybe the company you acquired is using FIDO2 keys only, right? And you're not even using FIDO2 keys yet. So these are all realistic examples of what has to be, thought through, like we said, design and discovery. But another interesting one is definitely around purview. So if you have a source tenant that's heavily into purview, they have labeled files, they have DLP policies specific looking for sensitive info, they have various controls that maybe even the destination tenant doesn't have at all, right? So how do you map labels? Do you decrypt labels that have encryption? Do you remove the labels and then transfer the files over? So these are all interesting things, and they wrap right back into the collab side of things, as we were talking about, right? SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams.
Yep.
So kind of falls into, could be endpoint security as well, even SIM/SOC capabilities, right? How do you support these new users that are coming into the large organization, if that's the case? So lots of good areas to think about, but I'd say those are kind of the key pieces around security.
That's actually a really good call out that I'm going to emphasize again is, and especially if you have an MSSP that's doing monitoring on your behalf, is making sure they're aware that this is going on, because there's going to be a lot of potential file creation, file deletion, new devices that are being onboarded, and now you're getting all these additional logs into whatever your SIM platform of choice is. If your SOC or MSSP is not ready to handle that influx, or if they're looking at the logs in a vacuum, you may start getting a lot of false positives or benign positives, or things like that that can bog them down from a potential real incident. So from a security perspective, I think going back to communication, I feel like that's the overarching theme for a lot of this conversation, is making sure that they're aware of what's going on too.
Yeah, I mean, user experience is going to make or break migration here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sad, I saw you come off mute. Did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
No, I was just gonna confirm. Yeah, agree to the user adoption. I mean, training is the key. If from a technology perspective, we can do all we want, but if the users are not using it, then it's kind of the main.
Yeah, it's setting expectations, right? So if they're assuming anything, don't assume, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're assuming that they're going to be familiar with XYZ MFA registration process, here's your new kind of experience, then that's when things go wrong. So
yeah, and where I've seen it be super successful, especially Sat, you were talking about your favorite 3 letters of RTO, or return to office, is as these organizations are getting more people physically in the same place, is we're actually seeing our customers either internally or bringing in a company like Netrix, who's doing the M&A, to host things like booths or tables that are in a centralized location that people know that they're getting migrated. They can actually come physically, and we can help them enroll in MFA, or we can provide that face-to-face support, things along those lines. And I think that goes really far in getting the user buy-in into this whole process as well, to say, hey, listen, I'm a real person. You're not just calling into our service desk or your service desk or whoever it is. Like, let's sit down and let's go through it together. And I know that by the time you leave that booth or you leave that table, that you're back up and running and you can do your job. So from a user adoption services, it's not just sending out emails or text messages or Teams messages or whatever it is. I think there's also that physical sort of in-person connection that becomes really important too.
The white glove service.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. We've got about 5 minutes left. One area that I do still want to go through, and then I'll turn it over to anybody else if they have any parting thoughts before we close this out. But One other area that we also don't want to lose sight of is Azure. So for those of you who are heavily invested in the Microsoft platform, maybe your source or your destination have an Azure presence. A lot of people look at it and just be like, okay, well, I can just move my subscriptions or move my resources over. And I wish it was that easy. Some resources are. So things like virtual machines, your virtual networks, some of those things, they'll move very easily. You just essentially initiate a move and there's no downtime. It just comes over. Everybody's happy. You don't really have to worry about it. Where we start to run into issues is that there are services in Azure that are tied to Entra. Things like key vaults, and anything that gets encrypted in Azure needs a key vault. So now we start to talk about what does that look like? How does that remediation work? What kind of outages do we have to take? Are there other services like Kubernetes or like Databricks, managed identities? These things don't move at all because they're so integrated into Entra that they literally can't be moved. They have to be deleted and they have to be recreated. One of the things that we've developed over the years is a large number of Azure Resource Graph queries where we can actually extract information programmatically from your environment and make a determination like what's going to move, what can't move, what has to be rebuilt, what has to be, what's going to cause an outage and things like that. I think it's important not to lose sight of that side of things. Once again, going back to even the digital workplace side or Power Platform, I feel like a lot of our customers forget about Azure too, because they're just like, okay, it's just a thing, it's just a handful of servers, or it's a handful of storage accounts, or functions, or whatever it is. Not realizing how business critical they are, and that once everybody's out of that tenant, that great, nobody can log into this web application anymore. So I definitely don't want to lose sight of that. I can wax poetic about this probably for another hour if I had the time, but unfortunately we don't for this. We only have a few minutes left. So before we wrap this up, I'll open it up to anybody else who wants to take the floor. If there's any other topics, solutions, technologies, et cetera, that we haven't discussed, and then once we're good, I'll close this out here.
I was just going to say that it should come as no surprise after listening to this that when we do these types of projects, we spend an awful lot of time on the discovery phase. Like that really is where a big chunk of that work is done, for all of the reasons we discussed earlier. So, I can't emphasize that enough, how important that is to the success of your projects.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, I would say one key technology domain here is devices, right? We've kind of alluded to it throughout all the user experience components, but in the end, users are using different types of devices, right? Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android, and all those could be managed differently. They could have different security policies. Some are domain joined. A lot are starting to be Entra joined only, as an example. Kind of leads to, we've worked with clients that in a divestiture scenario where they go cloud only. They had Active Directory, they had that presence, but they said, all right, why do we need this? Let's think differently, right? So it's a time to actually improve things on top of that. But potentially just devices for sure. The user experience is going to be based on the device the user's using. So making sure that's streamlined and communicated is key to take that into account.
Yeah, and I think that's where also having good tooling comes in handy, because depending on whether you choose to use a tool or not, you could end up having to reset everybody's devices and make the user stand everything back up and have it, join. Or there are tools that can very much streamline that process. So, I think that's where choosing the right tool, and I know a lot of companies hate to hear it, but spending a little bit more money and something that makes that user experience a little bit more seamless can go really far in terms of customer and user satisfaction.
Yeah, definitely.
And also communications, right? We talked about that a little, that communicating all through this from the discovery, again, it will help you find things that you might not have known was there, but also this could be the difference between 1,000 tickets on cutover day, right? Or just a handful. If they have no idea things about email changes and things like that, it matters, right? Communication to both sides, right, of this, of what's happening, when it's happening, how it's happening, why it's happening, is crucial.
Definitely. And it's not like you have to communicate everything. I know we opened, this discussion out with like networking changes. Most of your users aren't going to care that now you're connecting your two data centers between the organizations, et cetera. So you don't necessarily need to communicate that much, because you can get communication fatigue. People just start to see, oh, another email on the acquisition came through. They don't realize that it's actually germane to their job, or it's really important for them. So also pick your communication really importantly, or think about it. I do tend to err toward over communication. I think that's the better way to go. But there is definitely a way to overdo it. So try to find that healthy balance as you're running through that.
Yeah. And I'll just say the same thing again. I think we all said it multiple times. Plan in. Please spend some time to do due diligence, planning, and do not forget our digital workplace or Azure. These things are important. It's just simple 2-3 words, but there is so many that goes behind it, and a lot of businesses actually rely on these too. So we are here to help.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to leave it, as we're approaching the end of this webinar. But if you or your organization are looking at doing some sort of acquisition, or some sort of merger, or even a divestiture of one of your business units, or a portion of your business, please feel free to reach out to us. If you're already a Netrix customer, reach out to your account executive. If you're not, please reach out to us through our website, or through your favorite mechanism of getting a hold of us. We're always happy to talk through this and tailor plans and work with you as an organization to figure out what this looks like. Whether that's in terms of sequencing, whether that's doing that initial discovery, or that's helping you through the entire process of getting everything moved over. We're always here to help, and we're happy to have these conversations. With that being said, hopefully the information we've provided today is helpful to everybody who's watching this. Hopefully this has kind of piqued your interest, or at least given you an idea of how we approach mergers and acquisitions and divestitures. And with that, I wish everybody a happy rest of your day. And thank you to my fellow panel members for joining during this as well, and spending your time having this discussion. So with that, thank you, everybody. And
Thanks,
have a good
Al.
one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.